morning, and again, sorry for the delay, but we can get started at least now. And for those of you who need Wi-Fi, it should be appearing at some point. My name is Philip Saunders. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the director this year of the Marine and Environmental Law Institute at the Schulich School of Law here at Dalhousie. We're very pleased to welcome everybody to this joint effort between the Institute and the Canadian Institute for Resources Law in Calgary, with whom we've cooperated over the years on other projects, including an earlier iteration of the workshops funded through this series. This particular workshop for us is an immensely appropriate topic. We're very happy to have it here. The environment and the marine environment have been focused at the law school since the 1970s, when Doug Johnston and Edgar Gold started what was then the Marine and Environmental Law program, with a suite of courses that focused in these twin areas. Dalhousie has had the first certificate programs in both environmental law and marine law, and can be done jointly for a number of years, and it remains a major research focus of the law school. As they say, I'm not going to keep you long because I'm going to turn it over to Owen Saunders. Yes, a relative. Odd family choices. And he will explain give you the introduction to the workshop and some words about the series, I believe, and the Institute. So.
Thank you, Philip. Good morning. As Philip said, my name is Owen Saunders, and on behalf of the Canadian Institute of Resources Law, I'd like to welcome you to this symposium. Both those of you who are with us today here and those who are with us virtually on the internet. I'd also like to welcome you on behalf of Dean Ian Holloway of the Faculty of Law at the University of Calgary, who is not able to be with us today. Je voudrais aussi vous accueillir au nom du doyen de la Faculté de droit de l'Université de Calgary, Ian Holloway, qui ne peut pas se joindre nous aujourd'hui. Over the next couple of days, we're going to hear from some of the leading thinkers and practitioners in marine and environmental law in Canada. And I'm going to thank them right now in advance for taking their time to share their insights with us. Most of these speakers will need no introduction to anyone familiar with the area. Therefore, they're not going to get an introduction, or at least they're not going to get a detailed summary of the qualifications, since you're here today to listen to them, not to me. And you can find their qualifications in detail in the conference materials. Again, though, my sincere thanks for their willingness to be here with us today. And I would also like to extend our special thanks to Environment Canada. As Philip said, their funding has made this series of symposia possible. Je voudrais remercier aussi Environnement Canada qui a fourni le financement pour ce symposium. Now, as to the question of languages for this seminar, although there will be no simultaneous translation, participants, including web participants, should feel free to send in their questions in whatever language they choose. And of course, copies of all papers in both official languages will be posted to the symposium website. Pour ce qui est de communication pendant le symposium, bien qu'il n'y aura pas d'interprétation simultanée, les participants sont invités à envoyer leurs questions dans la langue de leur choix. Et bien entendu, les articles seront disponibles sur le site internet du symposium dans les deux langues officielles. Now, as to how to send in questions on the web, we're going to try and strike a balance between our physical attendees and our web participants. So for the web participants, please submit your questions for speakers, again, in either French or English, to the email address that you'll find on the webcast homepage. And then hopefully I will receive them on my iPad. hopefully. Je voudrais répéter pour les participants par web diffusion que vous pouvez adresser vos questions en conférencier, soit en français, soit en anglais, à l'adresse électronique que vous trouverez sur la page de la web diffusion. So without further ado, let's move on to the people you have come to listen to and learn from. And we're going to begin the symposium today with really an introductory course for lawyers on protection of the marine environment by a real scientist. And we're extremely happy to have with us today Douglas Wallace, who is a Canada Excellence Research Chair in Ocean Science and Technology at Dalhousie University. And he is also the Scientific Director of the Marine Environmental Observation, Prediction, and Response Network in Halifax, better known to people in the area as MAOPAR. So, Doug, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thanks very much, and I didn't manage to get all the lecture notes ready. The chemical oceanography course will be later in the afternoon. Okay, so I'm a chemical oceanographer, and I do, though, primarily as a result of working so closely in the MAOPAR network. I've come to appreciate both the importance and the fun that comes from talking with people outside of my discipline, and I hope it's kind of mutual. We'll see. So I'm going to take a very global perspective on this topic, however. It will be extremely broad, covering what I view as the emerging, the present and emerging issues and threats to the global marine environment. I think increasingly they are global in nature. They impact all coastal states and, in fact, the whole planet. And I will miss out on a few things that are also undoubtedly important. So I'm just going to say that before I start. I'm not going to discuss marine plastics, obviously an issue of enormous topical and real practical concern for life in the sea. I'm not going to talk about oil spills. I've got a feeling there's people in the audience who are more knowledgeable about oil spills and also certainly oil spill legislation than I am. And I'm not going to talk about, it occurred to me, shipping, even though I know that's, of course, one of the major issues for the ocean today and the ocean of the future. I'm willing to talk about them, but I've not got slides on them. So, for me, the perspective on the ocean is shown by this plot, which shows a projection of future population trends, shows here by continent, showing that, according to the latest United Nations projections, that we're heading towards something like 11 billion people on this planet by the end of this century. And what not everybody knows, I'm sure everybody here knows, but is the redistribution of this population growth is massive, in the sense that most of that population growth is foreseen in the later part of the century in Africa. And this, in and of itself, this population growth obviously is probably the principal driving force for pressures and threats to the ocean. Related to that, of course, and related to our energy use, is the continual increase of CO2 in the atmosphere and the impact on climate change. Yesterday, or the day before, we were about crept over 400. The trend is ever upwards, as initially, was first measured precisely by the late Charles David Keeling, who struggled with the US Department of Energy to maintain this totally influential time series, which we now call the Keeling curve. But the question really is, how high will we go? Or how can we go, and how high will we go? These are what are called RCPs, used by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, representative concentration pathways for CO2 and other greenhouse gas equivalents, which can be translated into emissions if if you can estimate the future sink strength, of which the ocean is an important component. And there are a whole range of these scenarios, really. These are still scenarios, including very pessimistic ones, RCP 8.5, which projects that by the end of this century will be over 900 parts per million in the atmosphere. That's a very scary one. One which people seem to focus on at the moment is RCP 4.5, which implies that as a result of framework agreements, for example, COP21, that we will get a handle on emissions and possibly even on CO2 sequestration, and such that emissions will drop towards the middle of this century, such that we might be looking at a 500 ppm rise. And of course, the nations of the world have agreed in principle to try and restrict emissions so that we have a kind of a global average warming of the order of 2 degrees or less. So that's a pretty ambitious target, however, as we'll see in a minute. So that's a fundamental question related to global impacts on the ocean. And the other aspect of the ocean, of course, is our dependency on it. So it's both our involvement with the ocean as human beings, but also our dependency on it. And in the MEOPAR network, this is our mantra. We say that our future depends on an informed relationship with the ocean. Of course, it applies to people in Halifax. It certainly applies to people on the West Coast, just facing 3 storms crossing the Pacific right now and about to impact the West Coast. We'll see how that is. But of course, it impacts everybody on the planet as a result of climate change, food resources, and mitigation of pollution impacts, biodiversity, and so on. So that's, I believe, holds true for everyone in Canada and on the planet. So from a scientific perspective, again, I kind of see there's 2 main things going on, and they're large scale and they're global. First of all, we are using the marine environment in fundamentally different ways, and we're expanding our use of the ocean. At the same time, we're becoming more dependent on it for energy, for food, for living space, for transportation and trade, et cetera, et cetera. So examples here, of course, are current expansion in offshore wind energy, the development of ever larger and deeper ports, the growth of population in our megacities, which tend to be focused along the coastline, the expansion of aquaculture worldwide, both in the coastal zone and, as I'll mention in a minute, potentially in the open ocean, the ever deeper and further offshore search for energy and resources and potentially minerals. All of this is going on pretty much everywhere. So we're using the ocean in new and different ways, and our reach into the ocean as human beings is getting deeper and further out. Let's just put it that way. At the same time, the environment itself is changing, and quite dramatically. So we'll see in a minute the massive changes in ice cover in the Arctic and ice thickness in the Arctic. We'll discuss sea level change, which of course has major implications for most coastal zones on the planet. But other issues which are more, possibly less direct, and maybe more unknown and harder to interpret or predict what their impact's going to be, the change in ocean pH associated with the buildup of CO2 in the ocean, and increasingly other chemical changes, especially nitrogen. Of course, human beings have massively impacted the nitrogen cycle of the planet primarily through invention of the Haber-Bosch process for nitrogen fixation, which has is now basically human production of artificial production or artificial fixation of nitrogen now has surpassed the natural fixation of nitrogen. So we are having a massive impact on nitrogen. For the oceans, that impact used to be felt primarily in the coastal zone through, obviously, sewage effluent, river inputs of high nutrients driving coastal eutrophication and processes like that. But increasingly, the nitrogen now is also being emitted into the air through combustion process, but also from agricultural releases, and being spread far out into the ocean basins, into the middle of the ocean basins, especially in the northern hemisphere, and impacting ocean ecosystems in the distant regions of the North Pacific and North Atlantic, where nitrogen is pretty scarce commodity, or fixed nitrogen, pretty scarce commodity. And what we can start to see the impact of that in the amount of nitrogen in certain parts of the ocean, especially off Asia, of course, where the impact's particularly large. What the impacts of that are on the ocean ecosystem in the far distant parts of the ocean actually is poorly understood, but likely to grow. And then we have warming, of course, and a number of factors associated with warming. So these are all global impacts associated with human activity on a global scale. So I'm pretty sure, let's see if I can get this for you. I was going to have this on the presentation just as a, oh, sorry, just see if I can get this animation. I don't think it's going to work. I think one of the most dramatic signatures of change is this one. So this represents a reconstruction of changes in Arctic sea ice age. So that is, Arctic, of course, used to at least have multi-year ice. And we can start to see the change in the distribution of that multi-year ice in the Arctic Ocean since 1990. Now, I started my career in the Central Arctic Ocean on a Canadian ice camp over the Alpha Ridge, sort of in the middle of that picture, where we, landed the Canadian Armed Forces landed a Hercules on an ice island and built a runway and built a camp, which lasted for, almost 4 or 5 months. That was basically north of Ellesmere Island. Couldn't do that now. I mean, you just wouldn't be able to find the real estate to build a camp of that nature. So you can see here that what's happening is that multi-year ice is not surviving, or it's being rapidly degraded in the southern Beaufort Sea, such that it's that's like 8-9-year-old ice. It barely exists in the Arctic now, just in a little sliver along, again, the northern edge of our archipelago. It's really quite dramatic. And that's the reason why, as you lose the thick ice, then of course ice and the thin ice melts much more easily in the summer, and the potential is there to have, in some period in the future, an ice-free, in the summer, not in the winter, but an ice-free Arctic, potentially, because the multi-year ice has been swept out or melted. So, in Paris, not so long ago, the agreement was made to try and restrict planetary warming to 2 degrees or less. But of course, in the Arctic, this is the temperature change basically between the last decade, and the 3 decades before that, since 1971 to 2000. We've already, in the Arctic, seen 2.5 to 3 degree warming in the central Arctic. So the Arctic has already exceeded that temperature change. And even if we stick to 1.5 to 2 degrees, the chances are, because of what's called Arctic amplification, we'll see a 5 degree temperature change in the Arctic. So implications of climate change in the Arctic, both through ice cover and also just temperature change and a whole bunch of other factors, are enormous, and for our Arctic. Okay, so chemistry, which is my subject. So CO2, from the point of view of the atmosphere and climate change, is absorbed by the ocean. It reacts with water, dissolves, and then reacts with water, which has removed a vast amount of the sort of anthropogenic CO2 from the atmosphere. Without the ocean, the global warming situation would be much, much worse right now. So over the past 200 years, the ocean's taken up almost 50% of the CO2 emissions that we've driven primarily by burning of fossil fuels. Now that's gone down a lot in recent decades, and that's mainly because of changes in ocean chemistry. What happens is that as CO2 dissolves and reacts with water, pH decreases. That's why we refer to ocean acidification, and hydrogen ions are produced by the top reaction there. That's the increase in hydrogen ion concentration or decrease in pH. But what really happens is those hydrogen ions also react with other carbon species in the water in a buffering reaction, which removes carbonate ion from the ocean. And there's a lot of carbonate ion in the ocean, or at least there used to be, but we're titrating it. We're doing a massive global titration by adding CO2 to seawater, removing carbonate ion, and it's the carbonate ion which helps organisms which make calcium carbonate, sort of limestone or calcite or aragonite shells. It allows them to do that. So there's a real potential of ocean acidification, and it's still, I'd say, very poorly understood. Again, many of these things are poorly understood. A lot of work going into this. But a real potential for ocean acidification to impact a range of organisms living in the ocean. Now, the change on the lower panel there, you see the change. You know, we've already decreased the ocean pH by almost 1 pH unit. Now, it doesn't sound, 0.1 pH unit. Doesn't sound like a lot, especially to a chemist. It sounds like nothing. But the ocean is and was extremely well buffered, such that over the past, say millions of years, certainly over the past 800,000 to 1 million years, maybe 20 million years, the pH has varied very little. Even though CO2 has gone up and down a little bit, the pH has changed very little. And now we're sort of overriding the buffer capacity of the ocean, the chemical buffer capacity, such that if we did get to 750 ppm in the atmosphere, for example, by the end of this century, still relatively high estimate, we'll have decreased the pH by 0.4, almost 0.3 to 0.4 units, which is massive. I mean, that pushes oceanic pH outside of anything that the ocean has seen, well, for hundreds of millions of years. Very, very long time. And organisms have presumably adapted to the stable fixed value of pH, at least some will have. So that's one thing. Another thing, of course, is sea level rise, and this paper came out earlier this year, focused on impact of sea level rise on the continental United States, kind of looking at the neighborhoods which are potentially threatened by current projections of sea level rise. Those projections are shown in the panel there with the reds. You can see the sea level rise projected for the end of this century as a result of a number of processes: ocean warming, glacial melt, changes in the Antarctic ice sheet, shifts in ocean circulation play a role, glacial shifts and gravity changes associated with changing ice sheets. Those are 5 or 6 different factors which lead to this very complicated picture of global sea level range, such that sea level rise in one place is not necessarily the same as somewhere else. Eastern US and to some extent Nova Scotia look particularly subject to change. But you can see that for that representative concentration pathway 4.5, the sort of what people might consider an optimistic one or reasonably optimistic one, we're still looking at global coastal mean sea level rise by the end of this century of the order of 0.4 meters. And there are other projections out there which are much more pessimistic, of course, than this. This is the sort of still the accepted one, I would say, roughly. But there's a lot of variability in that, and that's shown by those 2 histograms, one for the representative concentration pathway 4.5, that's the blue, and the much more pessimistic scenario 8.5 is the red. But you can see the significant spread representing the geographical variability of that mean sea level rise over the next 100 years. So some coastal areas are going to be significantly and affected more than the global mean. Others are going to get a little bit of a free ride. And these are the projections, backed up to some extent by measurements, but we really don't have a long enough time series of measurements yet to check these models very carefully. So that's physical changes and chemical changes. Of course, there's the changing way we use the ocean environment, especially, well, until recently anyway. We'll see how it goes. The global rush for offshore oil, of course, gone through a bit of a hiatus in the last few years. But the important point here from this figure is just to show how globally extensive the deepwater oil reserves are, extending into countries which presently have almost no marine research capacity at all, and presumably have very little environmental research capacity. And so this must be of some concern in terms of regulation and monitoring of environmental impacts. And a related issue, of course, is the continuing global shift of fishing pressure as the global fishing fleet from Europe, but especially more and more from Asia, extends, well, globally, but especially impacts food resources of, in this case, you can see a massive kind of expansion of effort around Africa, where the population is about to increase dramatically. How are we doing time-wise? So I need to go a bit faster. So anyway, the ocean economy is a large one, and on the order of equivalent in terms of annual GDP, as by some estimates, to at least maybe the seventh largest or most economically active country in the world, not counting oil and gas and not counting quite a few other things. Many people view that we're on the verge of an industrial revolution inside of the ocean as technology, especially the technology developed for extracting oil and gas reserves, starts to be applicable to other industrial uses. And in a recent paper in Science, it was felt that current trends in ocean use, which is kind of shown in a kind of a time perspective from pre-industrial times, medieval times to the modern future, that industrial use of the ocean is increasingly the dominant threat to ocean wildlife. So what we do in Mealpar, in this network, is we view these as two rivers of change: environmental change and changes in human activity, which tend to cause, in some cases, completely new hazards, which we haven't encountered before, or alter the intensity of hazards which existed previously. And also, especially human development and human uses of the coastal zone create new vulnerabilities or changing vulnerabilities, which together create altered patterns of risk, and in many cases, increased risk. To property, to life, to the ecosystem, to economic opportunities, and so on. So what Mealpar tries to do is bring people's brains, and especially young people's brains, focused on this problem in order to reduce vulnerabilities, primarily to use our brain power through science, but also partnerships and working across disciplines to figure out ways how we can cope with these changing pressures on the marine environment, on the ocean, but also on the coastal environment. Now, what I've not mentioned is some things which are on the horizon, and maybe not too far over the horizon. One of which, of course, is geoengineering. There's already been a few examples of ocean-related geoengineering, including one off our west coast. People here will know more about that than I do. I'm familiar with the science of this. But I think, I do personally believe that we'll see more of these types of activities. In this case, this was a deliberate fertilization of a large patch of the ocean with iron to enhance productivity with a view to grow more fish, basically, salmon, and with the idea that that would also partially solve the CO2 problem. The CO2 problem bit, we're not going to solve that. But I do personally believe there is some potential, maybe not the way they did it, but in the future with more clever ways of doing things, to potentially grow more fish. And that will probably, if people keep doing this, that will probably be the motivating factor to do this sort of thing. So I don't think this has gone away, and it is an attempt to mimic a natural process. Deep sea mining, again, people here will know much more about it, nodules or the massive sulfides or the crusts on top of seamounts, been talked about for decades. But the technology, the difference now, I think, is primarily the technology is now there, and I think most of you probably are familiar that Nautilus Minerals, Canadian mining company, is about to exploit some massive sulfide deposits off New Guinea. But the technology is being developed and it's available, and so these high-grade ores, in some case high-grade ores for copper, are in reach. Then deep-sea aquaculture. So we've dealt a lot with coastal aquaculture, but increasingly, and with absolutely the best of intentions, I should say, there are several companies working on creative ways to move aquaculture out of the coastal zone where it really can have a massive impact on the environment, out into the open ocean where frankly, there's more dilution and less direct impact on at least on coastal ecosystems, Cuna del Mar is an organization which is promoting this, and there's some very, very interesting creative ways to approach this in order, certainly with the idea that this will be an important source of protein for the future. So I'm going to probably finish on this one. This is a slide which was taken from a paper written by a very famous marine ecologist from Scripps Institute of Oceanography, Jeremy Jackson, who this is, I think, was published pretty soon after I finished graduate school, probably about in the early 90s. And at that time, he kind of mapped out the history of ocean exploitation, but also human impacts on the ocean and on the marine ecosystem. And of course, that started with fishing and continues with fishing as a major driver of impacts on the marine ecosystem, pretty rapidly followed by pollution. And of course, we see new forms of pollution impacting the ocean all the time, with microplastics being a particularly insidious one at the moment. We then dug up and built on the coastal zone. We destroyed habitat across the coastal zone globally, first of all in the developed nations, but this is now going on globally. We, as a result of primarily the growth of shipping and ballast water moving from place to place, we introduced species into places they didn't previously exist. And last, according to Jeremy Jackson, was climate change, which was, when he wrote this paper, was actually just still coming above the radar screen in terms of a potential threat to the marine ecosystem. And since this was considered a seminal paper in marine ecology was written, the change is accelerating. It's not really stopped. It's broadening in scope geographically, globally. And we can add a whole bunch of stuff to it. Ocean acidification, the rapid expansion of aquaculture, deepwater resource extraction, the growth of certainly of shipping and associated with international trade, the specter of geoengineering. So this is happening, my view, and again, scientists are happening globally. These are increasingly global issues challenging us. Again, from a scientific perspective, I kind of view the ocean as a frontier. Almost every week there's a paper published that you read and you say, oh, gee, I didn't expect that. That's a surprise. New species, new metabolism, a new process. There's ocean research papers constantly show up in the top journals of major discoveries, Nature and Science. So, kind of view of the ocean is that it's a frontier. This relates to the creation of the Ocean Frontier Institute here at Dow, really. But it really is still the edge of our known world. It's, in many cases, represents the edge of our knowledge of our planet. I think it's sometimes lawless. I don't know what you think. Certainly not everything in the open ocean is regulated. It's certainly not mapped. There's a lot of unknowns. Or we could consider it maybe wilderness in some cases. There are definitely new life forms to be discovered, maybe some monsters. Lots of opportunity, lots of economic opportunity associated with human expansion and human technological progress. There's things to discover that we can still explore there. We have to be brave often to explore the ocean. Lots of unknown risks. It's exciting and dangerous. This is our frontier. I think it's our final frontier. I think it's our final frontier. That's I'll finish on that note.
Thank you, Doug. I think it's the first presentation I've seen that's ended with William Shatner up there, but I'm sure he'd be delighted. We have some time for questions, as I said, both from the web and from the room. Now, for the room, I've got this mic, which I'm going to ask you to speak into, and you'll say, but it's not working. It is working, but this is the one that connects you to the web, so the web people can hear you. In terms of this room, you're just going to have to speak loud enough, I'm afraid. So, yes, Magdalena.
Institute of North America.
Make sure you hear.
What I'd like to just ask you to comment on, you said you weren't in your presentation, but can you comment on the issue of marine plastics and particularly microbeads and how this is going to integrate into the other challenges you've referred to?
Yeah, so actually, there's definitely people, especially people here at Down, much more knowledgeable about the impacts of microbeads and on marine organisms. Clearly, it is of major concern in all organism classes, ranging from zooplankton up to birds, and everything pretty much in between. The striking thing is, again, I think, if I was looking back through the literature on this, actually the other day, partly to see whether I was going to fit it into the talk or not, and decided it was too much. And people have been talking about marine plastic contamination of the open ocean and the ocean for 20, 30 years. There's some really excellent papers going back 20, 25 years ago. I'm not exact. I guess it's just the intensity of the amount being released, and also the fact that we're finding it now in these really remote locations. I think that's what's motivated the sudden upsurge in interest and concern, which is leading to regulation. My view is it's long overdue, because it would have been better if we'd regulated before there was a problem. That doesn't even remotely answer your question, I think, however. So, do you want me to comment further, or in my view, it's necessary to.
Well, and I think the particular issue of the microbeads and the potential toxicity within the ecosystems is something that parties are now starting to regulate, but also learning more about.
Learning more about, yes. And again, what we're seeing now is those early work studies which I mentioned, which didn't really focus, admittedly, they focused more on debris than microbeads. The early studies tended to be done in a very unsystematic way, and what we're seeing now is much more systematic approaches to the study of distributions and also toxicity, which is to be welcomed. And as a result of those more systematic studies, we're probably better able to assess the impact of regulation, I guess.
While you're thinking, I have a question. It wasn't a major focus of your talk, but certainly for the oil and gas industry, carbon sequestration has been a big deal. Some people say this will solve the problem, or it'll solve a lot of the problem. How much do we have to look forward to in terms of that as solving some of the problem anyway?
So, certainly in terms of carbon sequestration close to generation sites, where in power plants and so on, I think there's a growing consensus that will be necessary in order to attain the framework on climate change target. Just most scientists I talk to at the moment don't see any way to get to that by just shifting to a new energy technology. It has to be combined with carbon sequestration close to generating sites, and a lot of people are arguing that we will need carbon sequestration technologies that can remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And that's, it's not impossible, there's some really interesting ideas being worked on. The energy efficiency and the cost is an issue. But I think, again, it's just a personal viewpoint, I'm not an expert, but I see growing interest in this from the climate change community, mainly because they just think it's necessary to attain even the fairly moderate targets which have been set for climate change by the end of the century. But the ocean probably won't be a useful, the ocean waters won't be a useful sequestration location.
Thanks. Linda Nowlin, West Coast Environmental Law. I'm wondering if you could comment on cumulative pressures on the ocean and talk about how some of these threats might be synergistic or additive, or the other words you use.
Yeah, that's the issue really, is all of these things are happening at the same time. And scientists like to choose, we like to kind of isolate things and study things factor by factor. It becomes extremely difficult to do the experiments on cumulative impacts, but the fact is that we're seeing warming and acidification, for example, at the same time, or warming, acidification, and habitat destruction at the same time. And so This means that it's a real challenge to the way we do science. There was a couple of slides in there which we're going to touch on that, but I'm not really convinced we can empirically and experimentally handle this. With the issue of ocean acidification itself, it's taken us about 10 years to get to the point where we sort of know how to do the experiments properly dealing with ocean acidification. We're just starting to do the experiments with kind of cumulative impacts. It's very difficult, but the reality is that impacts are, well, pressures or stresses are occurring simultaneously, and the chances clearly of cumulative impacts are definitely there. Difficult to detect at the moment from the field studies and the experimental studies, but they must be there, and it suggests that we have to work on all fronts. That's what it suggests to me. We can't just solve the CO2 problem and leave the others alone.
I'm going to ask another question. You've just talking about ocean acidification and the dramatic change in pH levels. Just from a practical point of view, I wonder if you could give some examples of what that means. I mean, will there be some ecosystems that actually benefit from this? So there'll be adaptation, obviously, but what sorts of things are scientists expecting from this now?
I mean, most of the focus has been on organisms which require, as part of their life cycle, construction of shells, what some chemists call them hard parts, but let's call them shells, made of calcium carbonate, because that's the sort of something where we can see a kind of a thermodynamic tipping point, which in many ecosystems we're already close to, or in some cases have already crossed, or a threshold. So that includes, certainly coral reefs, which are of course threatened. I mean, that's a classic case of multiple stresses and cumulative impacts. It's kind of hit by warming, by acidification, and by eutrophication, and human development, and everything all at the same time. But on the more pelagic systems, definitely certain planktonic species, especially both in the phytoplankton, but also in the zooplankton, organisms like pteropods, which are an important component of certain food chains, but also coccolithophorids, which are important both for food chains, but also actually for climate regulation. Both they impact albedo and some kind of strange gases which potentially mitigate climate warming. So various aspects, most of the emphasis has been up until now on calcium carbonate forming organisms, especially the corals, but also certain planktonic species. The Arctic is a region which is particularly sensitive, partly because it's not so well, and it's also already at the threshold. And that's an area where actually, despite a few studies, I would say, again, we have limited impact, limited understanding of the impact. Clearly, again, multiple stresses, though. Probably the bigger factor will be warming and sea ice reduction on that ecosystem. But acidification is another thing that's coming in there. So I think it's mainly on the calcium carbonate forming organisms, but of course, in terms of commercially important species on the west coast, a concern over oysters, and especially on oyster larvae, and on the east coast on lobster, especially lobster, early stages of the lobster life cycle. And DFO and also Miopar and others are doing quite a lot of research on those, what we think might particularly sensitive organisms.
Well, thanks very much. And we're ending exactly on time, so thanks for that incredibly cogent and condensed overview. I think we all know we're still not scientists yet, but so thanks very much for Professor Wallace. It was a great presentation, I think. We're going to move on now to actually an issue that was alluded to by Professor Wallace, and one that's of growing significance in both the West Coast and East Coast, and that is aquaculture. And our first speaker on this is going to be Aaron Ward, who is the staff lawyer with EcoJustice in Toronto, who in a previous incarnation, I think in the Maritimes, did a fairly significant amount of work in this area from a legal perspective. So Aaron, I'll turn it over to you.
Yes, great. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. As mentioned during the introduction, my name is Aaron Ward. I am a lawyer and not a scientist. So this is going to be a bit of a flip of the script here, perhaps, in terms of the detail that we delve into, and this will be light on science and a little bit heavy on law. I'm a staff lawyer at EcoJustice's Toronto office. EcoJustice is a national environmental law charity. Our mandate is to argue precedent-setting public interest environmental law cases. I'm new at EcoJustice. Previously, I had an office in the Marine and Environmental Law Department at Dalhousie as the executive director of East Coast Environmental Law. And so that's an organization, a charity as well, that does primarily law reform and legal education work. So I did do some aquaculture work during my tenure at East Coast, and I will be referencing some of that in the presentation today. Before I sort of delve into the meat and potatoes of this presentation today, I would like to thank just a couple of organizations and a couple of folks who have helped contribute meaningful research to this area of law that's emerging in Nova Scotia. First of all, my former employer, East Coast Environmental Law, and secondly, the Ecology Action Centre, who are a charity based out of Nova Scotia who do good work. And finally, although they will be named directly, Professors Meinhard Doel and William Leahy, who know far more about this than I do, I think, but I can be nastier about it, so that's why I'm here today, I think. So today what we're basically planning on covering, I don't have a lot of time, so I'm only going to get into the detail that I'm able to get into, but a brief overview of what I'm going to be talking about today is a general overview of aquaculture in Nova Scotia. I'm going to talk a little bit about this regulatory, very fulsome regulatory process that we recently went through here in this province. I'm going to cover the new regulatory framework that came out this past year, and I'm going to look as well at how that framework is being implemented and provide some commentaries so that it's not just policy wonks like myself sitting at our desks, but maybe a little bit of on the ground or in the water experience as well. So aquaculture in Nova Scotia, I mean, most of you folks here probably know this is a very divisive issue, and there is good and there is bad, and I intend on touching on both of them. So in a nutshell, what is aquaculture? Aquaculture is this is from the government, and I'll take it. It's the breeding, rearing, and harvesting of fish, shellfish, plants, algae, and other organisms in all types of water environments. So that's a broad definition. In Nova Scotia, aquaculture dates back, we have evidence over 100 years. First Nations groups would transfer fish populations between streams to keep them viable or plant small oyster ponds. Not really the type of stuff I'm going to be talking about today. I mean, modern aquaculture in Nova Scotia and other places has become, heavily industrialized. It's bigger, it's more intensive, and that can be both where we derive economic benefit, but also where there can be some environmental harms or potential harms. Aquaculture is a not insignificant contributor to GDP in Nova Scotia. A rough estimate is about $60 million a year, about 600 permanent jobs. In a small province like ours, that goes a long way. There's about 270 sites currently active. That may or may not be true given that some are dormant right now, but that's our best estimate right now. Species that are farmed include mussels, oysters, trout, and salmon. Salmon being the largest contributor to the economic side of this, about 80% at any given time. Mussels as well can be lucrative, but really salmon is sort of the cash cow, if you will. And our government supports this provincially in Nova Scotia. They've given loan guarantees to companies. They've invested in research and enforcement. They're very gung-ho about growing aquaculture. And so this is our provincial government with our quite tall Premier Stephen McNeil in the middle, and on the far right is the Honourable Minister Keith Caldwell, who's the Minister of Fisheries and Aquaculture, and he's sort of the voice at the table around a lot of discussions dealing with aquaculture. The federal government as well, we think anyway, is quite supportive of the development of further aquaculture measures. There was a Senate report that came out in this year, in 2016, that essentially echoes an industry ask that aquaculture be doubled, in the coming years. So this is definitely viewed as a growth area. It can only occur. I mean, you can have on-land aquaculture, and there can be some done in lakes, but the reality is most of this happens in coastal environments for now, anyway. Perhaps deep sea aquaculture will grow more, but that does mean, if we're going to double it, a significant increase in intensity in aquaculture operations on the East Coast, as well as other places. And so, as I alluded to, with that kind of intensive development of an industrialized farming practice, there can be some cons as well. So there's sort of two main categories of concern that people have, I guess with a third being human health. But the first is the health of the fish themselves. The second is the health of the surrounding environment. Some things that can happen around these, particularly, I would say a particular concern, shellfish aquaculture is generally viewed as being fairly sustainable, particularly oyster aquaculture. So what's of particular concern to environmentalists and coastal communities as well would be finfish aquaculture, and out of that, as you can probably imagine, would be salmon particularly. So some of the things that can happen, and they don't always happen, but they are potentials and they're cause for concern, absolutely, are things like anoxic conditions created by waste feed or fecal matter. So basically, if you have a ton of fish that are put inside of an encasement that's in the water, and they're in close proximity to one another, and you're dropping in food, and the fish obviously are eliminating waste, you can get situations sometimes where essentially underneath these cages are dead zones, for lack of a better word, where life simply can't exist because there isn't oxygen. Other issues that can happen would be the application of chemicals to these sites, things like pesticides, anti-fouling agents, antibiotics, other medication. In Nova Scotia, there hasn't been recorded use of pesticides for sea lice treatment, which is a parasite that affects salmon, probably for the last 10 years, but there has been recorded application of pesticides at other sites in other places, including a fairly significant application, I believe in 2009, where a large amount of lobster were killed by what was found to be an illegal application of pesticides in a New Brunswick fish farm. And actually, I believe the presentation after me is going to go into detail, so it's nice to touch on that. That's the doomsday scenario, perhaps, is when things like that happen. But they do, in fact, happen, and that'll be discussed at a little bit more at length. Other things that can occur, fish can escape from cages and they can interbreed with wild salmon populations. The wild Atlantic salmon are an impacted species, as you all know, I'm sure, off the coast of Nova Scotia, so we want to do whatever we can to protect them. The science on this, and again, I'm not a scientist, but the science on this is not, there's no causative link that's been found just yet, but there are some studies out there that suggest that they're completely correlational, but with the increase in farming, of intensity of farming of salmon populations in open net pens, which would be pens that are dropped into the ocean, there is an impact on wild salmon populations. So that's observable. We don't know exactly why yet, or if there's conflating factors or variables, but it's something that should be noted. There's obviously concerns about other species, wild salmon, lobster fishers. Lobster fishers are obviously one of the main groups that are vocal in opposition, because these operations can affect lobster populations, and that's a massive part of Nova Scotia's economy historically and currently. So, you know, one of the main things that we see here is that in coastal communities, or these small rural communities where this can be an economic benefit, oftentimes these operations don't have social license and to operate. And when I say social license, I mean the informal permission from, for example, a community for a given industry or project to operate. So you may have your permitting ducks in a row, but if someone doesn't want you there, they're going to make it very difficult for you to operate. So speaking of which, this is just a photo from a community of lobster fishers from Spry Bay, Nova Scotia, protesting outside of the Bedford Institute for Oceanography. This is ahead of the release of the new regulations that I'm going to reference in a few moments. So certainly you have both, you know, government and industry promoting aquaculture as, you know, perhaps not a silver bullet economically, but kind of one thing that should be in the mix. And then you have existing communities and other environmental organizations that are, you know, perhaps a little bit more skeptical. Because of this lack of social license that existed and, you know, some would argue continues to exist around particularly marine finfish, open net pen aquaculture, in 2013, the provincial government of Nova Scotia issued a moratorium on new applications for these types of sites and launched a regulatory review process. And so this regulatory review process, two law professors of mine back when I was at Dalhousie were appointed, so Meinhard Duell and William Leahy. They were essentially appointed to do a fulsome review, a complete overhaul of aquaculture regulation in Nova Scotia. The idea being that I think when they started, aquaculture regulations were 2 pages long, which is common in many jurisdictions. And the idea was we need a proper regulatory framework that not only signals to industry how they should operate and how to operate properly, but also can help develop and that element of trust between communities and industry so that this social license to operate actually exists. And to the credit of my lauded professors, they did a good job. They did a really good job. They didn't just sit at their desks and write regulations. I mean, that was part of it, but also they traveled across Nova Scotia. They held town hall meetings. They put together a science advisory committee. They commissioned research, which I should admit some of it came out of East Coast Environmental Law students and employees. So they really, they covered all their bases. And so in late 2014, the Duell-Leahy panel released what most of us call the Duell-Leahy report, and this was a significant report in scope, and as mentioned, it recommended a fundamental overhaul of aquaculture regulation in Nova Scotia. The core conclusion really was that aquaculture should have a low social and environmental impact, and it should provide high social and economic value. For those of you that are familiar, perhaps Nova Scotians, or have heard of this, there was an Ivany report that came out that essentially one of the main conclusions of the Ivany report was that we should have regulatory excellence, and that's something that we need to drive our economy. And so this was really an attempt to create regulatory excellence as it pertains to aquaculture. The recommendations in this report are too many to name here. I only have so much time, but some of the core ones included things like using a sort of form of coastal zone management to identify areas that would be either suitable for aquaculture, which would be called green zones, potentially suitable, which would be called yellow zones, or areas that were likely not suitable for aquaculture operations, which would be called red zones. Those would be things where, for example, they abutted national parks or could impact other species, or they're also based on biophysical factors, so the flushing of a site wouldn't be significant enough to ensure that other life would be able to exist. That type of thing. A second core recommendation was, and I alluded to this, but increased public participation in the regulatory process. And this would include not only increased access to information and transparency, but also the ability to participate in the regulatory process by holding public hearings in front of an independent body, allowing members of the public to appear and make submissions, and also the ability for members of the public to appeal a particular site license. So if there is a site, and only in particular cases, but if there's a site that's particularly egregious, the recommendation was that members of the public, if the government isn't acting, should be able to appeal to an independent body that this site license be revoked. Another big issue with the current regulations, as you can imagine if they're 2 pages long, was that there was too much discretion. So the idea was limiting the discretion that was placed on decision makers, also moving the standards of regulation from terms and conditions on the licenses and leases into the regulations themselves so that people could see them, they were consistent. So there are many more, but that's probably enough to give you an idea, and this report is publicly available online. So this came out, and perhaps to our surprise, working at Anango at the time, but I would say definitely sort of a mark of confidence to the process and to the folks that were running it. The report was lauded by government. Ango supported it. Industry gave their qualified support of it as well. Coastal communities thought that we were headed on a good track. So it looked really good, and we looked like we were poised for a complete overhaul of our regulations. We had our wish list, I suppose you could say. There was going to be excellent regulations coming from this. So at the end of 2014, we sat and we waited. And we waited, and we waited quite a while. Until in October of 2015, after nearly a year of waiting, the Nova Scotia government essentially released the new regulatory framework. And this framework involved a couple of different things. It involved an amendment to the existing Fisheries and Coastal Resources Act, which I'll refer to as the FCRA. It included 2 sets of regulations, the Aquaculture License and Lease Regulations, the ALLR, as well as the Aquaculture Management Regulations, the AMR. At the time of releasing this new regulatory framework, the government claimed, and this is a direct quote from Minister Caldwell, that this reflected a more accountable and responsible approach to aquaculture. Minister Caldwell did claim in interviews as well that this satisfied the government's promise to implement the overhauls that were recommended by the Dwell-Leahy report. So these different pieces of law here, first of all, the Fisheries and Coastal Resources Act. I'm not going to dive into them too heavily, but basically the FCRA lays out a skeleton for the regulation of fisheries, including that of aquaculture. It is a section on aquaculture. It contains the power to create regulations, as I'm sure you could assume, at least the lawyers in the room, and it does lay out some enforcement provisions and the power as well to appoint an independent board to hear applications. So that was something I alluded to earlier. There's Minister Caldwell announcing the new regs and the new framework. So the ALLR, the licensing regulations, they deal, as you can imagine, with the leasing and licensing of aquaculture sites. That includes things like determinations of site suitability, the terms and conditions of licenses, that type of thing. The aquaculture management regulations, the AMR, they deal with the management of the sites themselves and of the animals, including dealing with medical and disease information, these components called farm management plans, as well as environmental monitoring. So these regulations were released, the framework was released on the 25th of October 2015. It's dense, especially for lay people, but even a little bit dense for lawyers, especially dense lawyers. So we, naturally, a lot of the public were looking around and asking, well, what does this all mean? Does it implement what we asked it to? What do these things do? So enter ECLA, my former employer. We released this report on the 12th of November 2015. So as you can imagine, we got right to business as soon as the regulations were released. This report was co-authored by myself and ECLA's staff lawyer, Lisa Mitchell, and it is available online at our website, which is ecelaw.ca, if you want to have a look at it. I imagine the paper that I will be eventually releasing as part of this symposium will it's going to borrow off of that research for sure. But if you want to, have a look at it now, feel free. So what did we conclude? We concluded in this report essentially that the new framework was a mixed bag. There was some good for sure, but there was definitely some missed opportunities. So we've got a table here of sort of, a lot of this alludes to some of the things I was talking about before. So just going through some of the main ones very quickly. The FCRA and the ALLR were silent with regard to implementing what was considered a core recommendation of the Dwell-Leahy report, which is the green, yellow, red classification system. Instead, what we found is the regulations allow, and the FCRA allows the minister to designate what's called an aquaculture development area, or an ADA. It appears from our read, these haven't been used yet, but I'll get to that later, but it appears from our read essentially that ADAs are analogous to the green zones that were discussed in the Dwell-Leahy report. Applications for aquaculture sites located within ADAs, they do not require some of the things, they face a lower regulatory burden. They don't require an option to lease, a pre-scoping report, or a review board hearing. Instead, the regulatory process is administrative, and there's minimal public engagement. There's still, it would allow written comments, but it's not the same as sort of a public hearing. What remains unclear now is essentially, and it's of concern absolutely, is the discretion with which these ADAs are implemented. It doesn't seem like there's a clear framework set up or a clear set of factors that one should look at in order to set these out. It does seem extremely discretionary, so it'll be something to watch going forward. Another major thing to note here is that we've got green zones under ADAs, but there are no corresponding red zones. So what about sites that are biophysically improper or place other species at risk? Next to a national park, something like that, there's no increased regulatory burden, which was what was suggested at the time. Now, of course, these sites could still go through the regular regulatory process and be denied, but it does seem like things have sort of shifted and are leaning one way, certainly compared to the recommendations that were given. I'm going to skip a little bit here just in terms of time, but one of the main, another sort of core recommendation in the DL report was to hold public adjudicative hearings. And I did allude to this earlier, that there is a mechanism essentially to appoint an independent review board. This is a good thing. Now, the issue is that a lot of license applications are never going to see this more fulsome regulatory process. So it's only new license applications or significant amendments outside of prescribed ADAs that trigger this process. Site renewals or other amendments go by way of this administrative hearing that I spoke about briefly. So what these mean is that these hearings, they call them hearings, but they're in writing. They limit public participation, and there's just less participation in the process, less transparency. Speaking of transparency, one of the conclusions in the DL report that was extremely important, and in my opinion, one of the most important things was transparency and more information being made available to the public. As a way to build trust between public and industry. I mean, oftentimes industry would say, well, we're not doing anything wrong, and the public would say, well, we have no way to make sure that's true. We can't actually see that's the case, and I'm sorry, but we don't trust you. The provisions regarding the release of information in the new regulations, they fall short of the standards set by the DL report. The regulations do require the release of certain basic information, things like a notice of option to lease, hearings, decisions, that type of thing, minimum requirements for certain things like farm management plans. But the release of most information still remains discretionary. That includes things like information provided by a proponent, inspection reports, complaints, the farm management plans themselves, the actual content of them, veterinary records, mortality events, that type of thing. So this isn't to say that this stuff won't be released, because it still could be, but it's left completely at the discretion of the minister, and there's some pretty broad language in the regs talking about just how broad that discretion to release information is. So again, it means that the regulations or the framework is essentially asking the public to trust in us, to trust in government, to trust in industry that things are going to go right, or that the information they're releasing is the very information that people want to read. And there's economic pressure here, obviously. Particularly troubling to myself and some other organizations that were looking at these regulations, there's a couple of sections of the FCRA, sections 8, 5, and 19, which had the effect of amending our freedom of information and privacy legislation. What they essentially do is they create an exemption for certain aspects of veterinary records as they apply to aquaculture operations. So based on our read, anyway, of these provisions, it appears that it would be impossible for a member of the public to be able to tie a particular veterinary record to a given aquaculture site unless there's consent from the owner of the animal. FOIPOP was basically how we found out a lot of information about these sites previously, and it's, anyone can probably sit around here and understand that amending FOIPOP to protect veterinary records around fish doesn't smell right. There's already an exemption in FOIPOP for confidential business information. The burden would be on the person that doesn't want that released to show why it shouldn't be released. And this essentially not only reverses that, but actually just puts a big block there. And for people that want to find out if a site in their community is doing right, like who the bad apples are and who the good ones are, this certainly puts a big block in there, and I think harms public trust significantly. Enforcement mechanisms were increased, and they did a good job of that. There seems to be more resources being put into enforcement. There's fines that are scheduled out that are now standard. There's some good stuff there. One thing that doesn't exist in the new framework, and I spoke of this briefly earlier, was the ability for members of the public to appeal a particular license. So if there's egregious activity going on that's in contravention of a site license, it appears for now anyway, it's up to the government to make it right. So those are some of our conclusions. There were many more, but I mean, getting into speaking regulations can be pretty technical, so that's some of the high-level stuff. When this came out, I did some media. That's Minister Caldwell and that's me, both on camera, I think, CBC or Global or what have you, and there was certainly some sparring that happened. He claimed to the public that they followed all the recommendations. I claimed to the public essentially what I just claimed to you, perhaps in a little bit higher level. Some of the things that I found odd were the minister did admit to retaining a significant amount of discretion, even though that was one of the core recommendations of the DL report, that basically it be moved into law and discretion not be retained. But he tried to sell this as a good thing because, I don't know, he's the minister and he knows best. Anyway, so it'll be interesting to see how this goes, and a lot of you may be asking, well, this is great. This is all theoretical. We have all of these, complaints, as well as, some compliments about the new scheme, because it really is still a more fulsome regulatory scheme than you'd often see in most other jurisdictions. So, a question I had recently was, well, what is the climate in Nova Scotia now that this new regulatory scheme is in force? And you can see here, this is taken off the departmental website a few days ago, and this essentially shows you in blue dots, you've got shellfish aquaculture sites that are already in operation. Orange dot, there's a lone one there, shows those sites that are proposed. And similarly, the green dots show marine finfish sites that are currently in operation. And if there were yellow dots, which there are not, it would show you finfish sites that are proposed. So this is probably going to change pretty soon, but right now what's happened is that 2013 moratorium I spoke of, it has been lifted for shellfish and for trout. It remains in place for new applications for salmon while some of the science is being figured out. That's what we hear anyway. So, you might say, okay, well, there's not a lot of movement here. There actually has been, because a lot of these sites that are in green here have in fact gone through a renewal process. So what appears to be happening is there's no new applications for finfish aquaculture right now, but there's loads of renewals. You may remember that I just mentioned that the renewal process for these sites faces a much lower regulatory burden under the new framework than new applications. And so, without diving into particular case studies, we've heard reports anyway of sites that are really perhaps not renewals. They've been dormant for a really long time, or they're moved by large distances, or perhaps the boundaries are being increased a little bit, are being sort of pigeonholed into this renewal process because it's easier and it's available. Renewals don't require a hearing in front of an independent regulatory board where members of the public can make submissions. They are in writing. So it's obviously a matter of concern for us. The government does say that the moratorium on salmon is going to be lifted in 2016. So we are still taking a bit of a wait and see approach here. If we want to double the amount of sites, that means we need new applications to come through. And so we're very curious to see how the new regulatory system and how this more fulsome regulatory process will apply to these new sites. Is it really going to be as rigorous as we hoped it would be and as the DL report suggested it should be? Or are people going to find their way to kind of do the minimum they need to just get their site running? So there'll be lots of eyes on this going forward. We're taking a wait and see approach. I'm sure ECLA will probably be publishing on this more, and hey, maybe EcoJustice will have a case or two. We'll have to see how it goes. So that's it from me, unless anyone has questions.
Thank you very much. Okay, we do have time for questions. Professor Wallace.
Interesting. I'm just wondering, in the new regulatory framework, where does science come in? Is there explicit place for scientific information in any of the in the framework, and especially related to that, are monitoring requirements regulated?
Thanks. Yeah, it's a good question. So the framework does include there's basically a science council or sort of roundtable that's been appointed, and then in terms of monitoring requirements, there are things in there. The way that it appears that the government is sort of doing this is they are leaving a little bit of it up in the air. So there's this component that I touched on briefly called farm management plans, and these are going to contain a lot of things like animal health and things like monitoring the site itself and chemical applications, that type of thing, as much as you look at them provincially. Now, what's an element of concern for us is what's standardized and in the regulations as publicly available are the minimum requirements for farm management plans, but not necessarily the information as it pertains to any particular site. So the idea is being, if there's a certain element of concern at a certain site, you can put that into a farm management plan and hold a site to that. That's the idea, is that it's in writing. As far as I know, and we'll see how this plays out, but there's certainly no requirement to make that information available to public or other people that would be keeping an eye on it. So that's an element of concern for us.
Thank you. I have two questions. One is there any hint of area-based management in the proposed or the existing regulation or any proposed measure? And second, what do you think is the fundamental difference between the old regulatory framework and the new regulatory framework?
Sure. Okay, yeah, those are two good questions. If I have them correct, the first question was whether there's any area-based management component of the new regulations, and the second question was, what was one large fundamental difference between the old framework and the new one? So, yeah, I guess you could say there is some form of area-based regulation in the new framework. That would be the only one that I can see really would come from these aquaculture development areas, which I spoke of briefly. And essentially, these are areas that are supposed to be earmarked as being suitable for aquaculture activities. And so they go through a little bit of a different regulatory process, one that is a little bit easier to get through. There's a little bit less of a burden, and can even involve like a request for proposals from the minister, basically saying this is where aquaculture should be, move on in. Now, I don't know. I've heard whisperings well, first of all, I can say for certain that this hasn't been exercised yet, that there have been no, since the new regulations have come out, there are no aquaculture development areas that have been designated. I've heard talk that it's never going to happen, but I mean, again, we're taking a wait-and-see approach. What there certainly isn't, which was one of the core recommendations of the Dwell-Leahy report, is there certainly isn't this idea of this red, yellow, green coastal zone management-esque idea where you identify sites generally, regions generally as being more or less suitable. And that is something that is used in other countries. If I have this right, I believe it's used in Scotland and or Norway, possibly both. So it is something that's worked in other jurisdictions, but it is something that we didn't implement here. Now, in terms of a fundamental difference between the old regulatory framework and the new one, well, the old regulatory framework was really, really thin. So the fact that there is one is probably a good start. Another main thing is that a lot of the regulation around aquaculture in Nova Scotia, it came out of terms and conditions that were placed on leases and licenses, particularly on licenses, and those were, well, I'm sure well-intentioned a lot of the time. They were extremely discretionary. So what you do have now, at least, is you have a more standardized set of requirements for sites to operate. So that would be a big one.
More mics.
Hi. You mentioned that the premise of the DL paper is low impact and then high social value for the nature of that economy. Is the fact that the government is permitting aquaculture an assumption that there is high value to this type of economy, or is there some sort of case-by-case analysis with each application to evaluate that sort of value?
Sure. Well, I guess I would start by saying that as far as I can tell in the regulatory framework and any government communication that's come after the framework has been released, there's been no mention of this idea of low impact, high value. It's not something that, I would argue it's not something they adopted. Now, if you want to talk about, particular sites and whether there's going to be, positive economic impact and whether that would have an impact on whether you would allow a site to go forward, yes. I think it's Section 3 of the licensing regs, I believe, has a significant number of factors. They don't match up directly with the factors that were suggested by the DL report, in that things like socioeconomic impact have sort of become economic impact. But there certainly is, within the regulatory framework, to answer your question directly, there certainly is some form of an assessment. I'm not sure how it's going to work exactly, of the economic impact of a site. And that does come into play when decision makers are deciding whether to allow a site to go forward.
Aaron, this is outside the scope, so feel free to answer as evasively as you wish. One of the things that's always troubled me with the aquaculture regulatory process, which is now subject to different constitutional approaches in British Columbia, Nova Scotia, and some other provinces. PEI does its own thing with the federal government, and it's not even bifurcation anymore, it's a quadrification or something like that. But it's pretty clear that some of the aquaculture sites, either that currently exist or will soon exist, are not actually within the territorial boundaries of provinces. Did the review have any mandate to consider the problem of a provincial government authorizing, regulating sites, forget about the fisheries jurisdictional problem, but simply the territorial jurisdiction, in waters that may or may not be within a province, particularly in a place like Nova Scotia, where the definition of what's in the province may vary from bay to bay, depending on the territory at time of confederation. So did that come up at all in the process?
Yeah, it certainly is, by my read of the report anyway, it certainly wasn't a focus, and I don't think it touched on it, but it's a really good question, because it's certainly not, what we've been focusing on in terms of the regulatory framework and how it applies, and particularly in terms of how people have been operating, especially salmon farms off the coast of Nova Scotia. But I think that, as discussed in the previous presentation, you're starting to talk about deep water aquaculture. Absolutely, since the Morton decision out of out of BC, you've got a different look at how aquaculture is regulated there. It's certainly differing province to province. One thing that the 2016 Senate report that came out recently concluded was that essentially all regulation for aquaculture should go back to the federal government, and that there should be a federal aquaculture act, and that should basically be what carries weight. So, I could foresee, I'm certainly not an international, marine lawyer, law of the sea guy. That's the territorial boundaries are not and how jurisdiction plays out in conflicts there is not my area of expertise. But it certainly seems like it'll be interesting if there isn't a federal act that comes out, and perhaps that's what what we'll end up needing is something that's more federal blanket legislation. And as there's more litigation coming from this, particularly on the West Coast, maybe something there will force the government's hand. We'll have to see. But I wouldn't be surprised at all for this government in the next little while anyway to take up that suggestion out of the Senate report to draft a national act.
Yes, I can't believe we went that long without a question on federal-provincial relations in a Canadian legal symposium. What's happening? Actually, I was interested in the same thing, because I knew about the Senate report, and I wonder if you could just comment from your perspective, the NGO, what kind of federal input was there into the regulatory regime, at least in terms of the hearings? Did they just absent themselves entirely, or did fisheries make representations? Or?
You know what, on that one, I'm not really sure. I mean, it certainly wasn't discussed at length in the DL report. Now, I mean, there were, dozens and dozens of town hall meetings and roundtable meetings involving industry. I would be very surprised if the federal government didn't have a voice in the table at some of those. But this idea of, I would say that the DL report is primarily anyway silent with regard to how conflicts and how regulation of this might go forward. I mean, I think there was just sort of the report essentially accepted the fact that provincial government has jurisdiction to regulate this, and they're planning on writing new laws, and therefore we're going to inform the content of those laws. But perhaps a little bit more dialogue going forward would be a good thing.
I had just one other question, especially in light of Professor Wallace's presentation. I'm not going to ask you to do the science of this, Aaron, but did the report address the implications of climate change in terms of this sort of rosy scenario of doubling the amount of aquaculture and so forth?
Yeah, so the DL report anyway spoke of industry pressure to increase aquaculture, but didn't necessarily endorse the idea of doubling the production. I think that the focus of the DL report, I mean, there were lots of calls, during these roundtable sessions and input provided into the regulatory process that said we shouldn't have open net pen finfish aquaculture at all. It's bad for the environment. It's bad for communities that shouldn't exist. So really, I think what Meinhardt and Bill thought as they're looking through this and they're listening to other people give them perspectives on science, and they're obviously looking at the economic piece of that. I think the balance, without speaking for them, I think the balance they thought they were striking was, to allow this at all is already striking a balance between sort of those that don't want and those that do. The idea of increasing it by that amount, I think, I doubt they think it would be realistic, but I mean, going forward, we'll have to see. So it certainly wasn't it was more, I guess, practical nuts and bolts as opposed to worrying about the outside. But again, there was a focus on science, and there continues to be a roundtable, and I'm sure there must be some informed perspectives around the table on, how, climate change could impact, and how this could impact climate change, and also how climate change could impact the suitability of farming operations.
Thank you very much. That was a great presentation. we're not finished with aquaculture, and indeed the federal government will be having a voice here after the break, because obviously there's the issue of enforcement and some of the challenges raised by that. So we are going to break for 15 minutes. There's coffee for people in the room. Those of you on the web, you can make coffee, tea, or maybe you want to check up on what Mr. Trump's been up to today if you're a little racier. Anyways, we will be back in 15 minutes. Thank you.